It's been another late night here in the Canadian Grand Prix paddock, not primarily because of the Lando Norris-Oscar Piastri collision, but because of a protest by Red Bull against the race-winning Mercedes of George Russell. This was all about George Russell's driving under the safety car. Did he drop too far back from the safety car? Was he driving erratically? Was there some unsportsmanlike behaviour involved? John Noble, what did you make of it all?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one because you occasionally get kind of these safety car moments where drivers are braking and accelerating, but very rarely goes to a protest. And I think this is part of a kind of a story that's been bubbling away all weekend relating to Max Verstappen being on these 11 penalty points, so 1 point away from a race ban. And I think Max had suspicions he was potentially being goaded into overtaking George under the safety car, which would be a breach of the regulations, which would be a penalty, could be a point, which could be a ban. And I think this was Red Bull's concern. They felt that George mentioned it was unsportsmanlike conduct. They'd been kind of riled a little bit, I think, by what George Russell said yesterday after qualifying on pole position, where he was talked about his racing with Max. And he says, I've got a few more points on my licence to play with. So yeah, let's see. That annoyed Max when he was asked about it at the press conference. It obviously annoyed Red Bull today. And that's why they went for the protest that eventually was thrown out.
Yeah, we talked about that in our Saturday video. And of course, the stewards were having none of it. They basically said, well, it's not the driver in front's job to look and see where the driver behind is. They said he looked in his mirrors to make sure he wasn't directly behind him. All fine. There was references to unsportsmanlike intent in the communications and actions. So do you think Red Bull ever thought they had a realistic chance of getting a penalty for Russell? Even a 5-second penalty would have cost him the win and actually dropped him off the podium.
Well, I think that was obviously their intent. Obviously, there was a race win at stake for them if they could get George a penalty. They referenced Sergio Perez at the 2022 Singapore Grand Prix. There were 2 times he didn't maintain the distance behind the safety car. 1 time he got a reprimand because of the wet weather. 2nd time, it was a penalty. And let's rewind to last year's Qatar Grand Prix. George Russell got a penalty for a safety car infraction. So it can happen. I just think it's very, very interesting that there were 2 protests from Red Bull today, one relating to the distance behind the safety car, one relating to the erratic driving. There was a protest against George in Miami as well. So there's a bit of a bubbling kind of rivalry and intrigue there between Max Verstappen, Red Bull and George Russell, isn't there?
Yeah, very, very much so. And I think even though the protest was thrown out, I don't think there's any doubt that maybe George Russell was thinking, well, if we can invite him into a few little fun and games here, maybe something can happen. We should note that the stewards did say that actually the team didn't complain to race control about it, although George Russell did over the radio, so they knew it was alerted to them. The stewards say they observed it at the time, but they weren't concerned about it. So it's not just Red Bull tilting at windmills here, is it? There is a little bit of intent on the Mercedes side as well.
Well, I think George is aware of Max's situation with the penalty points. I think it was raised. Red Bull team boss Christian Horner told us tonight they actually spoke to race director Rui Marquez over the weekend. They're aware that drivers had made some comments about Max's penalty points, and I think that a concern from them that perhaps in these 50-50 situations, drivers would maybe take a bit more chance with Max. And it's not impossible. Max finds himself in a situation where he can do nothing, gets involved in an incident, gets that penalty point and is banned for a race. Red Bull asked Rui, just please pay attention to what's going on, take these things into consideration. And I think that's what's potentially prompted that action today. Christian Horner, when I asked him, said, do you think George was trying to goad Max to overtake? He said, just look at his comments after qualifying. So it's there, and it will be there for another race. We've still got the Austrian Grand Prix. Max's first points don't come off until the Monday after Austria, so he's still got 3 days of action to go through before he can start breathing a little bit easier.
Absolutely. It'll be seen as a potential weakness to exploit for rivals, particularly George Russell, because this has been going on for a while, hasn't it? Remember George Russell's comments in Abu Dhabi last year. So this Verstappen-Russell needle, it's building up quite nicely, isn't it? There's not a championship fight between the 2 of them, but I think Russell certainly hopes down the line there will be, and this is probably what's in his mind, isn't it? He's trying to make his point, and Verstappen is probably trying to put Russell in his place. So there's a nice bit of tension.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's almost a consequence of where this championship is playing out. McLaren have got a clear advantage at the moment. They're racing at the front. And it's that fight behind that's very, very close between Red Bull and Mercedes. George has been in great form all season. And Max has just found himself battling with him quite a bit. Same at the end of last year. And I think it's just quite interesting because Max obviously has been prodding George a bit and on track, and George isn't afraid of speaking out, saying what he thinks off track. They had that moment in Barcelona, obviously. Max apologised on the Monday, and then I found it quite amusing that the pair of them met in an airport a few days later and didn't discuss it at all. I think they're more interested in getting kind of pushchairs and the baby through the airport screening machines. So this is one that will run. We saw there was some video tonight of George and Max walking away from the stewards, meeting together, talking to each other. But I think it's one of those kind of sporting rivalries that is going to continue, because I can see these two continuing to fight for positions and potentially for wins going forwards.
Absolutely. There's going to be some bigger incidents than this one. And I think the stewards' decision was perfectly reasonable. Was the Red Bull protest founded? I mean, you can't blame them for having a go. That's what happens. And of course, this all happened because of what happened with Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. That's what caused the late race safety car. Big talking point, means the championship lead for Oscar Piastri now grows to 22 points. What did you make of what happened there?
Yeah, it was. We knew something was going to happen at some point. I think you've spoken to McLaren CEO Zach Brown about this. Andrea Stella's talked about it. They were quite open that it was not if something happens between their drivers, it's when. But I don't think we expected the circumstances they would be today. A great race. Oscar seemed to be a little bit on the back foot in the closing stages. Lando was coming through with fresh tyres, getting closer and closer and closer. And there weren't many opportunities here to get past. He'd missed the opportunity when Oscar didn't have DRS behind Kimi Antonelli. Then he got DRS, but still close. Then he made a great move at the hairpin. Brilliant move from Lando, but couldn't hold on to the apex long enough. Then they ran side by side up to the last chicane. I mean, that was the moment where I thought potentially there could be some trouble here if one of them squeezes or they don't give up. And Lando very sensibly let Oscar through. But you thought that was a great move, because then Oscar's lost momentum. They're going to come out and he'll have a go. And that's where it all went wrong. Lando made a mistake. He saw Oscar just kind of nudge slightly to the right. But that's where he stayed. And the gap that Lando believed would open up didn't open up. And by the time Lando realised there was no gap, he'd hit the back of his teammate.
Yeah, I mean, in the championship context, it was frankly a monumental blunder from Lando Norris. It was an honest mistake. He wasn't trying to drive into Piastri. He just misjudged it. And obviously the track's curving there. And yeah, you just make that mistake. Andrea Stella did say you can kind of get sucked into that sometimes, and that's maybe what happened. In a way, it's a win for McLaren, isn't it? Because although they only finished fourth and they lost a car in this race, it didn't cost them a race win. It was a clear-cut one. Lando Norris was apologising over the radio immediately. So it's actually a really easy one to resolve, but a really good chance for Andrea Stella to say, no, McLarens do not make contact. We want to let you race. You've got to respect that. You've got to leave a little bit more margin, a little bit more caution. So although McLaren expected this, they probably feel they've got away with it in that it's been quite an easy one to deal with.
Yeah, I think it's a dress rehearsal for what may still be to come at some point later in the season. I think it was good. It wasn't a ridiculously late lunge that's caused it. It wasn't one of them squeezing the other off the track. It wasn't one of them doing something stupid. It was a genuine error from Lando. The very fact of in seconds he put his hand up and owned up says a lot about him. I think something Oscar appreciated a lot as well. But I think what it does give McLaren is, as you said, and I think you spoke to Andrea Stella tonight, the chance just to lay down the law that contact is not acceptable. But it gives us a framework going forward, because this is going to happen again. These two are going to be fighting for wins, and potentially the next time there is some contact, one of them may be at fault. And then it'll be really, really interesting to see how that is dealt with. Because I still think, as I said earlier, this is a dress rehearsal. The proper, not controversy, but the proper difficulty of what to manage and stuff is still to come.
Yeah, there's every chance they'll cross swords on track. Again, it won't be quite so straightforward, but I think Oscar Piastri will be quite happy about the way things played out, because championship-wise, it's huge for him. And I wouldn't blame him for having had a little chuckle in his helmet to himself when he saw what Lando Norris did to himself. So a very, very significant day in the World Championship fight.